Hello, and a very warm welcome from me to this event, which is part of the University of Cambridge's Alumni Festival on the future of work. We come to you live from the Sidgwick studio, and I'm aware that we're joined by a worldwide audience, and I'm welcoming all of you to the event. My name is Bhaskar Vira. I am head of the Department of Geography at Cambridge. It's my pleasure and privilege to convene and host this event, and I'm joined by a distinguished group of colleagues on the panel. I really look forward to hearing their contributions. I'll set some background to the event. Over the last couple of years, we've been building a program of research and teaching on the future of work, hosted at the Department of Geography. This includes an undergraduate course on work and employment, PhD projects, as well as a number of postdoctoral researchers. We've sort of become the convening hub for this activity across the university and already work closely with colleagues in sociology, in the education faculty, in the Cambridge Judge Business School, and economics, amongst others. And we're hoping that this builds into a more significant body of interdisciplinary research and teaching. Just to set out some of the issues that the panel is going to be talking about, even before the COVID pandemic, it was already evident that the future of work in the 21st century was likely to follow a very different trajectory to the established norms that had dominated the experience of workers in the post-war era, especially in what sometimes people call the developed world or the global north. Globally, it was already the case that work takes on diverse forms, and settled full-time permanent jobs associated with the right to organize, to social security, to retirement benefits, what people sometimes define as the key ingredients of decent work, were a privilege and enjoyed by only a very small proportion of workers. For many in the developing world, the global south, their experience of work has always been more precarious, dominated by what we sometimes call the informal economy. And by the turn of the century, it was already apparent that the 21st century was going to be very different. We'd seen a shift from manufacturing to services, and the consequences including in the geographical distribution of work, for instance, away from the industrial heartlands in the US and the UK, towards the financial centers in New York and London, creating spatial inequality as well as concentrations of wealth. In developing countries, while people remained dependent on rural and agrarian sectors, education levels were rising, aspirations were changing, people were increasingly in search of non-agricultural jobs, but these were precarious forms of work, typically in the urban informal economy. And we now see the rise of IT, which is also having profound impacts, not necessarily reducing employment, but changing the nature of jobs and changing the skills that are required to access these jobs. Initially, we've seen countries experiencing a boom because of outsourcing, because of call centers, and more recently, the growing dominance of platform-based forms of work, what some people are calling the gig economy. All of these patterns have now magnified because of COVID. Work itself has been fundamentally disrupted. We've seen agonizing images of people from the informal urban sector in countries like India being forced to walk to their rural homes as their jobs literally disappeared overnight. The burden of care work has always been disproportionately shared by women, and COVID has made this even worse. And as economies are starting to emerge from these initial waves of the pandemic, there are questions about what work will look like and whether any of us will return to the old normal. As governments talk about investment to build back better, what will this actually look like? Which sectors will thrive? Where will the jobs of the future be? How does all this link with the climate and biodiversity emergencies, the health and well-being of people and the planet, and the hope that we might be able to create green jobs that are also fair, equitable, and inclusive in terms of social outcomes? So this is a big agenda. We'll try and touch on some aspects of this today, and I'm delighted to have a fantastic group of colleagues who are going to help us to think about these issues. I'll introduce my fellow panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of you to say an opening piece, and then we're going to move into a discussion. Brendan Birchall, sitting on my left, is a professor in the social sciences. He's a member of the Department of the Sociology here at Cambridge, and his research covers the effects of labor market experiences such as job insecurity work intensification, bankruptcy, 0-hours contracts, part-time work, and unemployment on psychological well-being. Caroline Francis completed her BA in geography at Fitzwilliam College at the university before going on to postgraduate study at the Daiichi University of Economics in Japan. She is managing director at Accenture, a global professional services company that specializes in IT services and consulting. Catherine Boyce has a BA in history from Selwyn College at the university and a master's in economic and social history at the University of Oxford. She's director of enterprise development at CampFed International, a Pan-African grassroots-led movement which tackles poverty, inequality, and injustice through girls' education and women's leadership. And finally, Garima Sahai is a postdoc research associate at the Department of Geography and a bi-fellow at Murray Edwards College. She has research interests centering on youth and gender and is particularly interested in intersections between research, policy, and international development practice. And she's currently working with me and others across the university to help to establish a global commission on youth and work in the Global South. So thank you very much to all of you for being here, and I look forward to your contributions. Brendan, I'm going to start with you, if I may. What are the challenges and opportunities associated with the future of work? How do you see it playing out in your research?
Well, let me start off by saying that I'm going to start off by confining my comments to the global north, just only because there is so much other expertise on the global south here. And in thinking about the future of work, lots of the time we're thinking about what trends there have been, those gradual changes that have been going on for decades or even centuries, and how they might continue in the same direction. And in that way, maybe atypically, I'm an optimist, I would say, that lots of the worst catastrophes in people's working lives, I think, aren't as bad now as they have been in the past. We haven't experienced mass unemployment on the scale that we had in the 1970s or 1930s, again in the period since that. I mean, unemployment's still a problem. It's concentrated among the youth, certain parts of the country and certain parts of the world, certain ethnic groups, but not mass unemployment and mass misery as we've seen before. I've also been thinking a lot in the last, I suppose, 10 years about job quality, the extent to which people are doing good jobs or bad jobs. And again, we've seen movement in both directions here. But in many ways, the jobs we're doing now are better than the jobs that we were doing 10 or 50 years ago. They're safer. We tend to work in much better physical environments, better social environments still. I think people are better respected at work and better listened to at work these days. Unfortunately, there are movements in the other direction. I think work is often more stressed and pressured these days. But overall, I think there's been positive moves in job quality. And with the pandemic, of course, that's changed the way that we think about a lot of things. And I think with one thing people are saying with confidence is that working from home is going to be a much bigger thing. That's one thing that really is here to stay. It's not going to go away if and when the pandemic goes away. The thing that I have been thinking about a lot, though, in the last 2 or 3 years, I started thinking about this before the pandemic, is one thing that hasn't really changed that much in the last, say, 100 years, and that's that we're still, in the global north, very much a paid work-focused society. For most of us, for many of us, work is a huge part of our lives. And the surprising thing for me is that over that, say, last 200 years, we've become fantastically more productive than we were. We've got hugely better technologies, we've got a much better trained workforce, management is much more efficient than they used to be. So you'd think we could get the same amount of work done in a small fraction of the time. But there's very little evidence, and certainly less so in the UK and the United States than in other, say, European countries, that we are genuinely working less. And still the people who were working those long hours, often men, are still working much longer hours on average than women. So we're not harmonising as well, which again is just one of the many real sources of inequality in our societies. Partly this is maybe because we have got better job quality and people are better off when they're in paid work than, say, when they're unemployed, and we get very clear evidence of that. But you don't need to work long hours like so many people in our societies do in order to get those benefits of work. In fact, my research rather surprisingly shows that even working 1 day a week. You get just the same psychological benefits, the same connections to society, the same sense of meaning. So I'm thinking, what would it take for us to have a real radical shift in our societies away from paid work so that we're concentrating on other things? I mean, we never thought of this was what a utopian society would look like, being so work-focused. And sometimes it takes a shock, some sort of catastrophe, in order to bring about those changes. And I think one of the things is that it's been very difficult in our society for individuals to move away from paid work being so focused on their lives. And this is partly because we're so consumer focused, we see advertising the whole time. We all want better cars and better phones. The housing market, I think, has got a massive part to play because we're all being paid more, and then other people are being paid more, and we're competing for the same limited housing in many large urban areas, and that's just pushing up. So house prices are always staying out of reach of many of the society. And maybe one of the things that has started to prick that bubble to bring about these changes, not just on the individual level, but at organisational level too, we're starting to see a significant number of people saying, having tasted freedom from such long hours of work during the pandemic, that they would maybe want to stay with that. They don't want to go back to the full-time jobs they had before, that they realise they don't need to earn. And again, we're a very unequal society. So, some people have continued to experience poverty and sometimes extreme poverty during the pandemic, but other people are affluent, and that hasn't been a problem in our society. So that's the project I'm starting this month, is to look at whether there are individuals, or I'm more interested in whole organisations that decide they're just not going to go back to the 5-day week and want a whole different balance in work. And I think that might be, along with the other things that we thought were going to create these big changes in the future, the artificial intelligence and robotics and all those technologies, I think those things might bring about quite a reduction in people's time in work each week. We're already seeing other countries are ahead of us, particularly Scandinavian countries. That's, if I was going to say what's going to be exciting about change in those wealthy countries, that's what I'm looking at. That's where I'm hoping to see change.
Thanks, Brendan. And I think that kind of leads really nicely on to Caroline. I think, professionally, the world that you're in, these are profoundly different ways of thinking about work. What are the challenges and opportunities that this raises for business? And what is the response? What needs to be done? How can policy respond to that? What kinds of knowledge will support these transitions? How can the kind of relationship between places like Accenture and the university actually help to kind of advance that knowledge?
Absolutely, thanks, Bhaskar. I'm going to pick up at it actually from a skills angle, right, around skills and youth, because I think that's helpful here. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we mentioned, right, has created swift and turbulent changes in society, and also changes to work and the skills that we're looking for in work, which have changed fundamentally. Some of it was previously unimagined as a result of the COVID pandemic, while in other cases it's accelerated. So if we look at the trends to digital transformation and automation of work, that's definitely was underway, but has accelerated even faster in what we see in business. And I think really, the younger generation have been disproportionately impacted by these social and economic changes brought about by COVID, from the lack of access to digital resources to increasing debts of that community. So they need the support of business and educational institutions to really help them gain the essential life skills and resilience to empower themselves and transform their communities at unprecedented levels. There's a real gap in education, and the schools and teachers just aren't really equipped to take them on and the pandemic has really exacerbated that and really widened this gap. We need our young people to build skills that ensure their economic and financial security, mental health and wellness, and that can help them have a sustainable lifestyle. We need to prepare them with the ability of the jobs of the future, that they can enjoy long-term success, right? That's a different set of skills that were required previously. So we need to think big about the education with new forms of learning that foster more human and real-life skills that we're looking for in business, enabling young people to learn, connect, and realise their full potential and become powerful allies in solving problems and leading change. and really equip them for business and the world of work. So we're looking at, roles, jobs being automated, but we're looking at, good work being left behind, and how do we really equip young people with the skills leaving education for that new type of work and those new jobs. So, to give Accenture as an example, we've got a significant corporate citizenship programme. We've got a global strategy to bridge the digital and employment skill gap and help people to build the skills they need to secure and sustain employment in the digital economy. It's a really, really large programme where we're trying to develop skills in the community. And as part of this strategy, we've built 2 free online employment training programmes. One called the Skills to Succeed Academy, that's been around since 2013, which is a really large free tool for people to access. It's an online learning platform that provides skills, bite-sized modules to help people develop that skill set that we're looking for in the future, to develop them for the world of work. And then secondly, we've got a digital skills academy. So we launched that in 2018, but actually what's really interesting during COVID and furlough, the take-up of that has been absolutely massive. So during the first month of furlough, we had 50,000 enrolments. So the take-up and the demand is really there. People are looking to understand those skills they need in the future to do the future of work. And Bhaskar, you mentioned about partnerships, right? So, obviously in businesses, we're absolutely looking to partner with charities, educational institutions, and also our clients, right, to really put in platforms that drive scale. So those relationships and those partners help us drive scale, breadth, and really get to an answer even more quickly than we could alone. So I see those partnerships as being absolutely fundamental to what we do in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And everything that you've just talked about is challenging across the global north and south, and no better transition to the work that CAMFED and Catherine, you've been doing in rural Africa. I mean, these are challenges that are about how to equip young people to navigate their way through their life worlds and the world of work. CAMFED obviously started focusing on education, but so much of the work that you're now doing is also linking to enterprise development and their own future challenges. So how does your work respond to these challenges, and how are civil society networks of the sort that you are involved with equipping young people to try and support them in these next phases of their lives?
Thank you, Bhaskar. And as you say, we work in rural Africa, so I'm going to share some insights from experiences there and draw very much upon insights from my colleagues based across Africa. I think one huge difference or distinct element is the youthful employment challenge. So Africa is the most youthful region of the world. By 2030, 1/3 of the global youth force will reside in Africa. Already 60% of the population is under 25. And that formal employment, as I think you mentioned earlier, simply does not match up with the growing youth population. So at the moment, only 16% of the population across sub-Saharan Africa is engaged in formal work, so that leaves 84% of the labour force engaged in what might loosely be termed informal employment. So for us, we see, young people all around the world, they want hope, they want opportunity, they want the chance to build a good life for themselves and for their families. And so the opportunity that we see is around how we can help young people to create really good quality jobs for themselves through self-employment, through entrepreneurship. And in terms of the big context, I think there are huge challenges in terms of the resourcing of schools, education in schools. Also, there's this very significant gender element to this, which we're always focused on at CAMFED, which stands for the Campaign for Female Education, in terms of access to assets and technical assistance and financial literacy and decision-making power. Women are, on all metrics of these, including unemployment, disadvantaged compared to their male peers. So it's addressing that gender balance and addressing the challenges that young people face. In terms of CAMFED's response, we always start with education and we always start with collaboration. So we work very collaboratively across rural communities in Africa in partnership with ministries of education, in partnership with schools in each community. Members of our Young Women's Network called the CAMFED Association, they volunteer their time to go back into schools to deliver a curriculum which is called My Better World, which is about equipping young people with what we call powers, the powers to understand yourself, to be resilient, to problem solve, to plan, to work effectively with others. And those, of course, are critical skills alongside literacy and numeracy as foundational skills for preparing for the world of work. And indeed, that support from the Canford Association volunteers actually translates also into improvements in literacy and numeracy, because simply having someone championing your success, another young woman championing your success, is very powerful. So it starts with education, but then also we see this critical period of the 6 months post-secondary school. So first of all, making sure girls can get into school, that they can stay in school, they can thrive in school. But then in those post 6 months, that's when young people are particularly vulnerable to pressures to marry early, perhaps to travel to an urban centre to look for work, which may not exist or be very precarious. And so it's about equipping young women at that stage with vital skills to plan their careers, core business skills, sexual and reproductive health, linking them to peer mentors through our women's network. I think that's really vital, that framework of support. And then going on, helping young people to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. You mentioned some of these trends, Bhaskar. They're as relevant in Africa as I think they are globally. Technology, just think of how Africa has leapfrogged the world with mobile banking, for example, seeing those opportunities, thinking of the space of agriculture not as an option of last resort, as it has historically been considered, but an area for growth and opportunity and thriving enterprise. And in terms of how we work in partnership, I think that's absolutely fundamental. No one sector or organisation can solve this huge challenge by working alone. So working in collaboration with ministries, with government, with other civil society networks, and with academia for identifying, the research around what really works. What is a quality job in this context? What helps people move from necessity to opportunity enterprise? What are the opportunities across the agricultural value chain for young people, especially young women, to take good jobs for themselves, employment for others? So those are some of the questions we're grappling with. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And, there's already so much resonance in what you've been saying with Brendan and Caroline's interventions, which was sort of possibly thinking about a different part of the world, but there's so many similarities. I'm going to draw Garima in. Garima has done a lot of her work in South Asia, so let's carry on expanding our sort of scope in that sense. But reflecting on your own experiences as well as the research you've been doing, Garima, so many of these issues I know are overlapping in parts of South Asia where I've also worked. But also tell us a little bit more about the idea of bringing together a commission on youth and work in the Global South.
So I'll start by speaking about the future of work as a broader theme. So future of work is generally analyzed in the context of technological change, especially in the global north. But I think I'd like to broaden that conversation a little bit. Thinking about the global south, as you were saying, technological change is relevant, but I think the demographic change and the youth bulge that countries in South Asia, but also countries in Africa, are going through is the significant challenge. An unprecedented number of young people are entering or are going to enter the labor market. So in this context, how do we absorb the sheer scale of young people? How do we provide them with jobs, with decent jobs, not any jobs, especially since the economy, the informal economy in some of these countries can be as large as 90%. How do we draw in young women into the labor market? And I refer to young women specifically because the female labor force participation in countries of South Asia is unexpectedly low. And in a country like India, it's been dropping, and that's the largest country in South Asia. So how do we go about reversing this alarming trend? There are also opportunities, and I think technology is important there. It makes possible remote quality education and training, as was pointed out, that's very relevant to jobs. It can mitigate mobility constraints, which can come in the way of young women or women in general entering the labor market, accessing jobs, especially in South Asia. But overall, I think that if policy could be structured effectively, then the youth bulge itself could be an opportunity. And I should say, not just an opportunity for countries of the global south, but for a world as a whole. They could be the workers and the producers, but also provide demand for the world. So I'll move to my research more specifically now. Some of my research has been on the issue of youth employment in India. I've looked at young women's entry into the labor market, and my research has shown that the factors which enable or curtail their entry into the labor market tends to be embedded in their daily lives. It also dealt with what policy needs to do to address these challenges. I'm now working with Professor Bhaskar Vira, Dame Barbara Stocking, and Professor Pauline Rose at Education to develop a commission on youth and work in the global south at the University of Cambridge. And the idea for this commission really came in recognizing the gravity of this challenge, which has only been made more critical and more urgent by COVID-19. I should say that there are several initiatives which are taking place in this space. We won't be the first ones, but they tend to be disparate. There are people within the private sector, within the public sector, within NGOs who are doing important work, but handling different bits of the problem. Through the commission, we hope to bring it all together. So the commission will be formed by members of businesses, by members of the government, NGOs, young people themselves, to look at the problem holistically, look at the interconnections. And the Commission will review national policies and practices, but also look at the latest academic research, a lot of which is, as Bhaskar mentioned, happening at Cambridge, and look at the lived experiences of young people to draw out recommendations that enable young people to make a living, but also make a life. That's the hope.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on one theme that I've already seen recurring, which is the importance of thinking about skills in ways that are more than just what the formal education system provides. And a lot of what you talked about in terms of online platforms, the kind of support and mentoring that you're providing, especially young girls, as they finish secondary school and start to think about the next phase of their lives, it seems to suggest that there is a fundamental rethink around what the formal education system is providing people, and is it equipping them adequately with the tools that they need for the next stages, whatever those next stages might be. And then what else do they need? It's not just getting through their exams, but it's about making sure that they have the social and other capital that is actually essential to successfully navigate the next phases of work. What does that say in terms of education itself? I mean, are we teaching the wrong things? Are we focusing on the wrong issues? How do we equip people adequately? Who wants to come in? You're all nodding at me. Caroline, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, very happy to come in. I mean, I think in terms of what we see now, there's a stat, isn't there, that is frequently cited about us not knowing the jobs of the future, 5, 10, 15 years. So what jobs are we really skilling for? And I think a lot of the work that I do with our clients is about thinking about how work will be automated in the future. We don't quite know what that looks like or what the jobs will be, and therefore, we talk about the skills, and just to give you a few insights of the skills that we see as critical as future, like complex reasoning, creativity, social emotional intelligence, sensory perception. So of the work that we are unable to automate, that repeated, high volume, high repeatability, those skills, are going to become critically important, we think, in the future.
And in your experience, how do we get that embedded into the way in which sort of curricula are structured? Because what I'm hearing is it's the soft skills that are not in the curriculum that actually equip you best. but there's so much focus on just getting through the curriculum in places where you work that, the opportunity to do all this other stuff is really limited.
Yeah, and I would say in the very poorly resourced schools in poor communities in rural Africa where we work, you may be taught science but not have a science teacher in the school. There may not even be a single female teacher as a role model in the school in some cases. So there's a resource and challenge just to teaching the core curriculum. And I think those core subjects are critical, but it's how we add on to exactly those sets of skills, Caroline, that you were speaking to, absolutely relevant in rural Africa as well. And that's, in our case, we've worked closely with the Ministries of Education to make time in the curriculum for women volunteers to come in and share that My Better World curriculum in schools. But we also find in places where there are very few teachers that actually children supporting each other to learn, an initiative which we've called study circles, which we've introduced in Malawi, is very powerful. That peer learning as well, so making space for that. So I think it's making time for a rounded set of skills within the curriculum rather than cutting something out. The other thing I just wanted to mention, of course, we haven't spoken so much about this, but the other huge crisis that we're facing, in addition, of course, to COVID, is, of course, the climate crisis. And that's a crisis which communities in rural Africa and other parts of the world are feeling very much now already, and it's affecting livelihoods, particularly farming livelihoods. So it's also building skills to address that crisis, which span from those core skills around things like decision-making and resilience, which you wouldn't necessarily think are climate skills, but help to protect people to protect themselves and adapt their livelihoods, to what we might call green tech skills as well, broadly defined to be relevant across different contexts. So I think that's the key element as well.
Can I follow up on that? Because I think the environment, of course, is very central, absolutely central to the world of work. Lots of the environmental damage we're doing at work, and then it's through our productivity at work that gives us that consumer power to do more damage in the way we consume in the world. Yeah. And this is why, again, one of the central reasons why I'm so interested in thinking how we can get away from that continual drive to increase productivity. And so we need to think of less productive things, ways of passing our time. And if we are going to have more leisure time or time out of work, it's not necessarily leisure time, often it's family time, often it's caring time, and sometimes it is productive in a different sort of way, people learning skills. We have to think of the education system as preparing people for that life outside of work as well as their time in work. So I think that's a real challenge. For lots of people, if you suddenly imposed upon them a big increase in their time outside of paid work, they would find it difficult to fill that, because to do that, you not only have to find things to do, but things that are meaningful, that give you that social interaction, that give you the discipline around your time that we get from work, that we know that are the things that are good about work. The other way of thinking about skills, going back to skills, is we know from all our evidence that one of the ways in which to increase the quality of people's working lives is to give them more discretion, more decision-making about their own, what they do in their work, how they do it, who they work with, and it leads to productivity as well. We've known this, the psychological evidence on that has been very clear now for about 40 years. And yet when we trace through what's going on in European labour markets over that time, a big puzzle is we see no increase in autonomy. We don't see people being able to use their own decision-making in work. And that's a big puzzle. And again, I think something we need to overcome, we need to think about, because of course people start their education in schools, but they should be continuing that education and that enrichment of their lives, that increased capacity inside employment. And we're not doing that.
Brendan, one of the things you've been saying for a long time is that society places too much value on formal paid work, and all the other ways in which people contribute and can enjoy their lives are effectively devalorized. You're sort of almost defined by your ability to be in paid work. And that's a sort of fundamental societal reshaping. I mean, Keynes told us we'd have the 3-day week. It still hasn't come about. So, and I think it links partly to what you were saying, Garima, about, we observe in terms of the recorded data that the female labor force participation rate is declining. It's not like young women are not doing anything with their time. It's just that society doesn't value what young women are doing with their time, in the sense of formal paid work being the only way people can valorize their existence. So, yeah, just let me draw you in on that.
Yeah, no, the unpaid care burden has always been disproportionately shouldered by women, especially young women. COVID-19 has highlighted that. So yeah, the way that we need to think about and conceptualize work also needs to shift. Nancy Folber speaks about it, Jaiti Ghosh speaks about it. There are several people who've been working on this area, and I think COVID-19 provides us with an opportunity to reconceive of work. And if I could just go back to the previous question on skills, and speaking of women again, I think digital skills may be really important in the context of a country like India. A recent Harvard study had found that roughly 70% of men can access mobile phones through which internet is accessed in developing countries, but roughly 30% of young women or women can access mobile phones. So if we're talking about future of work and we're talking about technological change, and half of the population roughly can't access that technology equally, then that, I would think, is a skill that also needs to be made a part of the curriculum.
So you've all been, in some senses, so just picking up on that, talking a little bit about the inequalities that already manifest themselves and that might get enhanced by the way in which the world of work is changing. Online platforms require digital access, the kinds of skills that you've just been talking about. If we do move towards more platform-based work, which at one level gives people autonomy, but you need that autonomy to be mediated through access to the internet. And while rural Africa and parts of South Asia have leapfrogged technologically, that access still remains highly unequal. So what, I suppose this is where we try to bring in the absent member of the panel. What should governments do? Because we don't have someone speaking on behalf of government here, but what should we expect policy to do in response to some of the kind of inequalities that are obviously going to manifest themselves even more? And again, anyone who wants to come in on that.
Well, computer skills as a mandatory part of the curriculum. If we're talking about a wider set of jobs, women being able to access a wider set of jobs, then information about them, keeping the constraints in mind. So if there are mobility constraints, if young women go to certain places, then information about jobs need to be supplied there. Those would be two things that come to mind.
I think there's also something about the breadth of the curriculum, right, and the policy around the breadth of the curriculum in the schools and the educational establishments to move them through so that the skills that are developed in educational establishments are actually relevant then to the future of work or the future roles or, the thinking that will be required in the future, even if we don't exactly know what the technology or the technical skills will be. So that kind of breadth of thinking across the curriculum and the policy around the education, I think, is important.
And obviously, we're speaking here as part of the Cambridge Alumni Festival. What I've always been struck by in terms of what our graduates go on to do is how little link there is often between the subject that they studied at Cambridge and the careers that they've gone on to make, which is fantastic because I think it reinforces what many of you have been saying, that it's the creative skills, it's the ability to think, and it's the ability to analyze a problem that actually stands people in good stead in their careers. I'm sure all of us probably ended up doing things which are very different to what we might have imagined we might have done. And it wasn't directly linked to the narrow curriculum that we pursued. So that kind of is an interesting way to think about teaching and what we pass on. Brendan, you've been doing this longer than me.
Well, certainly lots of things I learned at school and learned at university are just not relevant anymore. Things have moved on. Can I bring it back to, again, and I took a bit longer to think about what we'd be asking of government. Again, the environment, I think, is the one thing that governments have been found it most difficult to face up to in, say, the last 30 years when it's become very clear that we do have this real problem ahead of us. And certainly the world of work is going to have to change if we're going to meet the climate goals that are so important. This continued rush to productivity, to economic growth has to be faced up to. And it's not, some of those challenges are difficult, they're not easy, and it will take a lot of pulling together, maybe government in a different way to have experienced government before, if we're going to get a consensus to move forward on those issues.
I'm looking over my shoulder at questions that have been coming in, and I have in the conversation already picked up on several of the questions that have come in. One which I think we haven't yet talked about just picks up on what you've just been saying, Brendan. I mean, if we need to deliver on carbon reduction goals, as well as rethinking the world of work, as well as trying to create opportunities that are relatively equal across society, how do we kind of combine these agendas of social justice, environmental justice? What are the kind of ways in which we can actually, in a concrete way, think about, well, I don't know, examples that you might be familiar with, where this is actually happening? I don't know, I'm looking at you because rural Africa is probably where it's happening more than anywhere else.
Well, I could speak to it. A CANFED program we have is where young women who are working in agriculture, and that's obviously the predominant sector in the rural sectors where we work, are what we call agricultural guides, and they're sharing very affordable and locally relevant, climate-smart agricultural techniques. It's interesting, Brendan, your focus on the need to scale back productivity, because in the communities where we work, actually, a huge issue is hunger. And on smallholding farms there, you actually want to elevate productivity and yields so that you can get more from the land in a sustainable way, not need to deforest more of the land, but also so that you can have better nutrition, because many of the households are food insecure. So one initiative is the Agricultural Guide program that we run, is where young women are sharing techniques that are climate smart to help build resilience to the increased floods and droughts and unpredictable weather that climate change is causing, boost productivity as well in terms of yields. But that's also sort of a green skill, because it's a very locally relevant green skill in the community, helping young people to build better, more successful businesses as well. So that's an example I wanted to share.
Yeah. I mean, in the context of the rhetoric around leveling up, and I introduced spatial inequality as well. One of the things that we've seen is, deindustrialization has impacted parts of the north in this country. The jobs that are created in this future are increasingly looking like they'll continue to be in the southeast. So you continue to reinforce spatial inequality. In the global south, it's jobs that are being created in the urban economy, which attracts people away from the rural sectors, but you get these kind of, COVID-like impacts where people who were insecure in the urban economy suddenly found themselves literally destitute. So how do we marry this kind of desire to have environmentally green jobs, which need to be spatially distributed? You can't concentrate people in the way we've got these kind of agglomerations taking place. Brendan, you talked about the housing crisis. I mean, it's because we have a concentration of people in particular parts of this country that house prices are unaffordable. That seems to be like the spatial inequality seems to be really important.
Absolutely, and I mean, there are some things which individuals can change their own behaviour and, say, reduce their own emissions. But for so many of the really big problems, we can't control it by our individual behaviour. We can't just get out of the housing market that we're in. If we're in jobs in the global north more, again, very different issues here. It's the global north that are causing the emissions, that are causing these problems in the global south, by and large. They need to be government-led, they need to be societal changes, not individual changes. So to think about what it is about the incentive structures that make us, again, so well, people don't start out their lives, they don't leave school thinking, I want to spend all the next 40 years in paid work. And there are ways. We've seen other countries have thought of very clearly of ways of reducing the time that people spend in work and reduce the emissions that are being produced in work. But like I say, it has to be done at a government level. The government has to absolutely face up to it, take this seriously, and do it sooner rather than later. Clearly, delaying these things or waiting for the market to sort these things out is absolutely not going to happen.
I'm very hopeful as well that from a business perspective, there will, as a result of COVID, I think we've seen ways of working, differ, and that reliance of being in the southeast to attend an office every day, I think, is going to be, not the way of work in the future. And I hope that will create a greater spread, a better, distribution of people, say, across the UK that don't feel like they need to be tied to London, the southeast, every day of the week in order to do their jobs. And I think we've learned that, and I think we've come on leaps and bounds, and it depends on how we're going to be able to adopt a hybrid working and, actually within offices themselves, how we will come together and work together for particular periods of time rather than fulfilling, day in, day out tasks at a desk in an office. I hope that will become a thing of the past.
I mean, we see this in being reported in the financial press all the time. Different organizations in your world are adopting very different positions on this. Some are more or less mandating that employees come back to the office, and others are trying to understand how this new pattern might actually work out. From your kind of interactions, where is that starting to settle, or is it still very unsettled?
I think it's still very unsettled. I think there have been people, organisations that have put out, very, strong views either way that, we are now encouraging people to come back. That's the expectation, that will be the norm, versus organisations like ours that are looking more creatively in a more hybrid way, which is we will get people together in offices for when we need to be creative, when we need that team time, when we need to be together, versus that you have to be in the office every day, to avoid that level of presenteeism that, we may have seen in the past. So I'm very hopeful for the future of work.
Yeah, well, and obviously that addresses some of the sort of spatial challenges that I've been focusing on. How would that play out? And I again, coming back to the Global South, I guess it's mostly that rural to urban transition. That's the kind of big movement that takes place.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, for us, a big focus is how we can help young people, especially young women, access quality opportunities in the rural economy. It's not about restricting choice, but it's about helping them to identify and build opportunities there. And I think it is, it's sort of rooted not just in training and skills, but also it needs to be linked to resources, assets, particularly in a context where sort of men own the majority of the land and other assets, and there's a real imbalance there. There's an imbalance in status and gender norms and expectations of what women can do. So it's about building that supportive framework around young women, bringing the whole community along with us, including traditional leaders and local government and men and boys, as well as women and girls. So to maximise those opportunities. But I think it does go beyond skills. It needs to link to assets and resources as well.
Garima?
That's a tricky one. I think perhaps with demand rising in smaller towns, with smaller towns coming up, production systems will just have to respond to that, and which might ebb the flow from rural to urban. But it may take a while. I think time will tell. I'm really not sure.
I mean, some of what I think all of us are saying is that it's about creating opportunities where people are, rather than expecting people to move to the opportunity, because that's where that kind of spatial inequality takes place. And I think it comes back to Brendan's continued desire that we kind of might find our way to the 3-day week, because then people won't be thinking that they need to spend all of their time in the head office in London.
No, I think that's certainly true. And again, one of the difficulties, one of the obstacles to taking society towards that is that, again, both in the north and even more so in the south, we are such unequal societies, and it's difficult to formulate policies against the backdrop of that inequality in income, in resources. And again, I think it shows how inequality is destructive in itself when we want to reshape society in the way that we really need to do.
So I'm very aware of time, and I'm conscious that I've tried in my questions to pick up on a lot of the comments that have been coming in from the audience, which I'm very grateful for. As we close, I suppose, is there any one last thing that you were hoping to close with? Otherwise, I might take us towards a sort of summary. Anyone want to come in?
No, I'm very happy to hear your summary.
So, I mean, we've touched upon so many of these issues. I think what was really powerful to me is the fact that while we might present these issues as being somewhat different in the global north and the global south, actually they cut across so much. And the agenda of trying to think about what's happening to the future of work is really cross-cutting it's really important for it to be addressed in this holistic way. I think it starts from education, but it goes all the way through mentoring, support, the broader skills agenda, and then into how society itself thinks about work. And I think we've touched upon a few of these things. There's a lot more to be done. If you're interested in hearing more about it, obviously, please get in touch with us. This is the very start of what is a larger program of activity across Cambridge. And I just want to thank all of you for being here with us and to the panel for your wonderful discussion.
Yeah, and I'm sure lots of the alumni have got thoughts they want to get in contact. I'm very interested in anyone who's been themselves influenced by reducing working time in their organisation. Please do get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.